You know, I really hate racism. And I think that's why I was so in a sweat that night and so stressed thinking it, because I really hate racism. I'm so weary of it in our world. And it's because it's ridiculous, and we have educated ourselves enough to realize that there's no place for it in our world today anymore. But also it drives me crazy because I know that I have a cure for it. And I know that you have a cure for it. And this cure is also the cure for sexism, bigotry, poverty, and so on. Here's the cure according to the book Christ Object Lessons, 386, page 386. She says, no distinction on account of nationality, race, or caste is recognized by God. He is the maker of all mankind. All men are of one family by creation, and all are one through redemption. The cure for these isms is in that Jesus is our creator and our redeemer. The news that he once created us, and that he sees no divided lines, and that he redeemed us to save us from any kind of separation and lines. The story of creation and the story of redemption is the end of all bigotry. Or as we've defined in this series, the story of creation and the story of redemption is that important phrase of the primitive godliness. Godliness that comes from God. It's imparted to us, and it was originally imparted to us in the very beginning. So let's continue our conversation of primitive godliness, and it deals with this discussion we just had. But since it's been a few weeks and I've been in the other churches, let's review a little bit of what we've learned. Number one, Inspired Pen tells us that we will have a revival of primitive godliness. It will come. When the church accepts it, when the church wants the power of the Spirit of God, God will perform the gift of primitive godliness. But the church must be willing to accept. We've also learned that primitive does not have the definition that it has today. Primitive has the definition of original. Adam and Eve were not simple. They were not unsophisticated. They were not primal. They were created how? Perfect. In every single way. Primitive godliness of Christ within those who want it. Within the church, prayerfully today or soon. We've also learned in part two, as we looked at the traditions of Halloween, that Halloween it's not pagan in that it comes back to us from a religious system outside of Scripture. It comes through pagan religions, but it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. And it's a celebration of what the devil performed that day. And we learned that the truth of primitive godliness is not that we can cover ourselves or costume ourselves with our own righteousness, but rather in the righteousness of Christ. That in that day, He, Jesus, covered them. Amen? We learned that like primitive Adam and Eve, we need to be willing to sacrifice in our rest in Jesus. Adam learned he was alone. He felt alone. And what did he do? He went to God and asked. And then he rested in Jesus as Jesus created Eve. How did he create Eve? By taking a rib. We have to be like primitive Adam and be willing to sacrifice things that we feel are important to us. We have to be willing to rest in Jesus. And Jesus will create in us and for us the things we need. Now the Sabbath is both a memorial of creation and of redemption. The Sabbath, which was the next gift of God to mankind. First, it was the gift of vertical relationship with Him. Then it was the gift of a horizontal relationship with others. And then to sum that up and to remind us weekly of that need, He gave us the Sabbath as a memorial of creation and a promise and now a fulfillment of redemption that came through the cross. And therefore the Sabbath is a guard against prejudice. Imagine how different our world would be if the church had not forgotten the truth of God's holy Sabbath. So to help us illustrate this Sabbath recipe, which is our theme today, to help us understand this Sabbath recipe, I want to study a story that you may not have realized teaches us things about the Sabbath. You know the story of Esther, I'm sure. The people of Israel were far from home. Persia had come, conquered Babylon, and in fulfillment of the prophecies of Isaiah, Cyrus had come, the anointed one, the kingly Messiah, you might say. That's what the anointed one meant in the Hebrew. He came and delivered them from their bondage. And Cyrus declares, he proclaims in the kingdom that Israel is to go home and to build God His house. What does Israel do? A small remnant goes back and kind of walks around a bit and does nothing. But the majority of Israel stayed away from home. They stayed away from their responsibility. So God allowed something to take place which would encourage them to get out of Babylon, to get out of Persia, and go home and build Him a sanctuary. So they stayed, and God allowed a man named Haman, who tried to deceive King Ahasuerus into killing him. And the people were saved only by the faith and willingness of Esther, who decided to go before the king and plead on their behalf. She was standing in the place or in foreshadowing of Jesus' mission here. That now, what is Jesus doing? He's standing before the king and he's pleading on our behalf. So Haman is hung. The Jewish people are yet again esteemed and called to go home to build God a house. But in this story is triumph. And to remember this new triumph, to remember what God has done, they establish a new holiday. And I want you to catch the recipe of Purim. This new holiday that they create, in it is a recipe of Sabbath keeping. Turn with me to Esther chapter 9. Esther chapter 9, just before the book of Psalms, just before Job, we find the book of Esther. Esther chapter 9. Notice this is Purim. This is specific to Purim, but we will learn in it a recipe that very clearly is the recipe for how we are to keep the Sabbath day. Esther chapter 9, starting at verse 20. It says there in verse 20, "And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had what? Rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and of joy and of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor." I don't think it's coincidence that there are 7 steps or 7 parts of the recipe of Purim. Number 1 was it was a day which comes at the end of their stress. Number 2, it was a day where they were to rest from their enemies. Now, of course, you rest after, right? We have tiredness. Those are our enemies today, aren't they? Time. And then from that, we are to rest afterwards. 3, it is a time of sorrow turned to what? Remember what it said in there? A day of sorrow turned to joy. Number 4, from mourning, grieving, to holiday. Number 5, a day of feasting and joy. Why are they feasting and feeling joy? Because of the work that God had finished. God had redeemed them there in the story of Purim. God had saved them, and they were feasting and joyful. Number 6, a day of presents for one another and gifts to the poor. And number 7, it was a day to be shared with others. Verse 20 begins with the idea that Mordecai wrote letters to all the Jews near and far to let them know. But catch also at verse 29. Same chapter, Esther 9, verse 29. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority a second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. Their fasting and the lamenting was over. Their stress, their weariness, their tiredness, their stress with time, the buildup of all the things that have to be done, the things they need to do, were over. A time for rest. I want you to catch here that in this section where it tells us that it was a day to be shared, it also tells us the importance of time. They had to confirm the appointed day. They had to let people know what the right day was. Let me read through these again, and I want you to catch the recipe for Sabbath. That was Purim, but now I want you to understand this in the eyes or through the goggles of the Sabbath. Is the Sabbath a day which comes after the stress of the work week? Yes. Is it a rest? Is it supposed to be a rest from our enemies? Yes. Is it a time which was sorrow turned to joy? Yes. Of mourning turned to holiday. A day of feasting and joy. You mean it's a day of feasting and joy? The Sabbath is a blessing? It's a day of feasting and joy? Oh, wow. I wish we had understood that when it was a day where you watched the clock and you waited for it to be over. A day of presents for one another and gifts to the poor. A day which was to be shared throughout the kingdom. A day to confirm this is the right day. This is the appointed time. This is the right day. Do you see, church family, the recipe for the Sabbath, for Sabbath keeping there? This is the experience of the Sabbath that we are called to have today. In the Sabbath, or in this story, it is a recipe of both time and mindset. Let me repeat that, because this is important to understanding how to keep the Sabbath today. It is a recipe for time and mindset. What we're thinking, what we're pondering, how we're choosing to spend our energy of our brain, our mindset. As Adventists, we do a wonderful job of knowing the time. We also, though, are called to know the mindset in which we're called to have. In the Sabbath recipe is both a shared experience amongst all believers and an emotional connection. It's a shared experience. We know the time. We know when to meet. Right? We know Sabbath school, church. We know these things. Potluck every first Sabbath of the month. Right? We know the shared experience we're going to have. But it's also an emotional connection, a mindset that we share in this day together. There are other people this morning who are as stressed as you. There are other people this morning who are puzzled and trying to figure out how to make it through a new week. And there are people here this morning who are resting from those troubles like you. It's an emotional connection that binds us. I don't know about you. Something about when you ponder the Sabbath and you keep it in your mindset, your body starts to feel it. Your stress starts to understand it. Your brain starts to feel it, even when you're not watching the clock. Last night around 6 o'clock, my kids and I, or the boys and I, and later Eliza joined us, we were throwing the football around out here in the field. And we came out about 5:30 or so, and I was tired, I was exhausted. Felix had said, hey, would you come play football with us? And in my heart, I was like, I'm tired, it's been a long week. Okay, nope, I can do this. And so I said, yeah, sure, let's go. And I walked out feeling that stress, feeling that time crunch, feeling the things I've got to do to get ready, and all these things that I've got to get done by next week. And then I was playing, and then it was like I could feel just it melting off of me. And it wasn't because I was outside, that too, but it was because I knew in my heart Sabbath had begun. Shake it off and let it go. To rest in Jesus. See, it's a perfect reminder of why the Sabbath is placed where it is in the week. The Sabbath was placed at the end of the week with purpose and reason. The Sabbath is a foreshadowing of the second coming, as a reminder, a memorial of creation and of the second coming, of redemption. The Sabbath then is a reminder of the second coming. Now, does the second coming come before or after Great Tribulation? Comes after, right? We believe as Adventists, we know that the Bible is very clear. Tribulation and Antichrist, then Christ. 6 days of work, and then Sabbath rest. We know this pattern. We understand this pattern. Look at Isaiah chapter 25. Isaiah chapter 25, a verse about the second coming of Jesus and the hope that we have in it. Isaiah chapter 25 and verse 9. Isaiah reminds us how we're going to feel before the second coming or at the second coming. Isaiah 25 verse 9 says, "And it will be said in that day, Behold, this is our God. We have waited for him, and he will save us. This is the Lord. We will be glad and rejoice in his salvation." This is the mindset of believers at the second coming. And guess what, Seventh-day Adventist family? This should be our mindset as Sabbath begins on Friday night. This is our God. He's here with us. He's communing with us. He does that every day, everyone. We understand that just as we worship God every day, right? We don't only worship him on Sabbath. We worship him every day. But the Sabbath is a special time of communion between Creator and creation. And we can announce as Sabbath begins, this is our God. We've waited for him. For 6 days I've worked and I've stressed and I've put in too many hours. But now my God is here. We've waited for him and he's arrived on these Sabbath hours. Ellen White says, Great Controversy, page 636, it is at midnight that God manifests his power for the deliverance of his people. She's not speaking of the actual time, the clock. It's at midnight. It's at the darkest hour of Earth's history when everything is bleak, the world is falling apart. It's at that time that Jesus manifests his power for the deliverance of his people. Are you looking forward to the second coming? And we're Seventh-day Adventists. We should be excitedly waiting for the Advent, the second coming. And we're also then to be excitedly waiting for Sabbath. Our whole week should be planned around it, longing for those hours to come, waiting for that clock to strike sundown, right? Maybe we need to take out our sundown for Saturday afternoon or evening out of the bulletins the next Friday. Because that's how our mindset should be. Looking forward to the next one. This is important in prophetic realism as well. We believe, the Bible is very clear, Antichrist, tribulation, then Christ. Work 6 days, then Sabbath. How about the other side? You ever catch that their pattern follows the exact same way for them? Secret rapture, before tribulation, Jesus comes, take Christians out of the world, and then tribulation. Rest on the first day of the week, and then work. They've got that formula. Redemption, then work. Redemption, then work. It's not the Bible. It's work, stress, this stuff, then redemption. Right? Tribulation, then Jesus. Work 6 days, then Sabbath. It's why these doctrines that we preach and teach are so important and so vital to understand. They all work together in harmony. I don't know if this is true. I would hope this is true. I love this idea. I've heard pastors preach it before, that this world is about 6,000 years old and Jesus will return. So at the 7,000th year, the last 1,000 years, the millennium, will be with us in heaven. That it's 6,000 years of sin, followed by a 1,000-year reign with Christ in heaven. God placed the Sabbath right where it should be. It's at the end of the week as heaven returns right after tribulation. The Sabbath is literal. It's real. It's a part of our lives. But it's also symbolic of the rest that we find in Jesus. It's symbolic of redemption, that when we sin, we can go to God directly. While the Sabbath is human, something we can measure, the hours of the Sabbath are also divine. I hope you understand what I'm saying. It is divine, these hours. What did God do at creation to the Sabbath hours? He sanctified them. What does that mean? He made them holy. Who alone is holy? God is holy. The Sabbath hours are not holy by themselves. They're holy because of the presence of God in a special communion with creation during this day. God gave it to man. It is a gift for us. The very essence of Sabbath keeping is the definition of primitive godliness. It's a day during the week for us to put the cares of this world behind us. Not in front of us. That's a whole new week. Behind us. And to rest in Jesus. And that rest requires some sacrifice. The timing of this day is important for the shared experience of creation with our Creator. So family, we need to know that God set this time aside with reason and purpose. It was not by accidents. It was not by eeny, meeny, miny, mo. There was reason and purpose in His setting this time aside. There was reason and purpose in Him giving it to us. And therefore, it's not just the time we need to know. We have to keep it with reason and purpose, a mindset, an emotional goal. Hebrews 4:9 reminds us that there remains a rest for the people of God. Amen? This is post-crucifixion, post-resurrection, and Paul declares there remains a rest for the people of God. The Sabbath is a gift. It's ours to claim. It's His to work for. You know what the Sabbath reminds me of? It's a doctrine of salvation. Salvation, free gift, right? Can we earn it? Can we deserve it? Did Adam and Eve earn the Sabbath? Did they deserve the Sabbath? Had they worked all week? No. They rested and enjoyed. And Eve and Adam were only alive for a little bit, right? They were created during the sixth day. They didn't earn it or deserve it. It was given to them freely. Like salvation, we are not resting by works. We're not resting in what we do. We don't deserve the Sabbath. It's given to us. It's a free gift imparted to us from our holy God. But, like salvation, when we accept a gift of God, it's important for us to respond to the gift. Right? It's important for us to respond to the gift of salvation. He's offering salvation. We have to respond to it with confession and repentance. We respond to it by claiming it as ours. We respond by baptism. We respond by studying the Bible. And just like with the Sabbath, we respond to the gift of rest in our obedience to it. Here's what Patriarchs and Prophets 2:79 says. By obedience, the people were to give evidence of their faith. Mankind must appreciate and use the helps that God has provided. I know we appreciate the Sabbath. I appreciate the Sabbath. But it's not just appreciating it. It's using what God has given us. In other words, the Sabbath is not just it's a Sabbath, let's go to church and then go home. It's an experience. It's something that we're given, but something we have to use. It requires action. It requires obedience. To keep the Sabbath without reason and purpose, to just mindlessly go through the day, it's like eating chocolate cake without some kind of flour in it. It's basically just eating chocolate eggs. Keeping the Sabbath without purpose and reason, it's just a waste of time. There's got to be purpose in our Sabbath keeping. And don't worry, I said some kind of flour, so that illustration was gluten-free inclusive. The story of Purim reminds us the very reason and purpose of Sabbath keeping. A special time to rejoice in the Lord as we do things for others. Did you catch that in the recipe of Purim? It was a mindset, right? Pure joy, putting off all the things, the sorrow, the fasting, lamenting, joy, feasting, happiness, holiday. But they were also called to spend the day giving gifts to one another and to the poor. As Adventists, as I've said, we know the time. We're great at the time. We understand the time. We understand it's the seventh day of the week. But then we've got to use the rest of the day for others. The day for others. In general, if we have anything to fix about our Sabbath keeping, the one thing I feel I included, need to fix is that the day is not about me. It's not about me. It's not my day. It's not about me. It's my mindset, and I keep it on God, but the actions are a vertical worship of God and a care for others. Spending the day with special gifts for those around me. So, my fellow Adventists, ask not what the Sabbath can do for you, but ask what you can do for others on the Sabbath hours. Don't forget the important words that Jesus stated in Matthew chapter 12. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath, right? It's lawful to do good. But the context of that comment was that Jesus had just healed the withered hand of a man. So really what he's saying is that it's lawful to do good for who? Others on the Sabbath. My mindset should not be on me and on my needs. It should be on the needs of those around me. This is, as we've learned, the recipe of godliness. Christ imparts his righteousness on us, and then we brag about it to one another that I've got it. Is that what we do? He imparts his righteousness on us, and then we share that love with others. The Sabbath perfectly sums up the 10 commandments, to love God and to love others. And it's why we call the Sabbath the heart of the law. In these precious hours, we focus on God vertically and we focus on others horizontally. And remember, the last time, according to that paragraph in Great Controversy, that this revival took place was the apostolic age. And when you read through the book of Acts, what do you find Paul doing every single Sabbath? Preaching, healing, baptizing. Always in the work of others. Going out and working with other people and for other people. Why did he find Lydia by the riverside? Sabbath afternoon, he went out looking for someone to preach the gospel to. So I want to see this recipe now from the primitive side. Let's go back to creation before we close and see Sabbath keeping as we meditate upon the creation story. Before God instituted the Sabbath, he first instituted something else, and that was relationships. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2. We'll spend our last few minutes here in Genesis. Genesis chapter 2. Verse 24. Just before the Sabbath began, the first Sabbath on this planet, just moments before there was a marriage ceremony, he took the hand of Adam, he took the hand of Eve, and he placed them together. They were holding hands at this very moment, according to patriarchs and prophets. He grabbed their hands, and they were holding hands together, as Jesus himself said these words of verse 24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. I want you to know something important about this that your version may have, if you have a certain version. The word here for joined in the New King James is the Hebrew word davak. Davak, and it means to cling, to squeeze. It's like if you were in the midst of a stormy ocean and you had a life vest in your hands. Would you let it just go floating next to you? No, you would be clinging to that. Even the best swimmers would be clinging to the life vest. Man and wife were to squeeze to one another, cling to one another. Eve was a present, a perfect gift from God to Adam. And according to the very words of God, Adam was to cling to her. We are called today to cling to the gifts that God has given us. Every single gift, including the Sabbath, to cling to it, to guard those hours as Adam was called to guard with Eve. They were to guard one another, to cling, to become one flesh to one another, to cling, to squeeze, to hold. Verse 25 says, and they were both naked, the man and his wife, and they were not ashamed. The marriage ceremony and the Sabbath are correlated because they were given to us together. Man was not ashamed. Why were they not ashamed? Why were Adam and Eve not ashamed?
They hadn't sinned.
They hadn't sinned, and because they hadn't sinned, you're absolutely right, Bear. They hadn't sinned, and therefore God was covering them in a robe of righteousness, clinging together through the work and power of God. No. No, no, no.
When they sinned, they had baptism.
They lost it immediately. They tried to hide right away, right?
But they started dying too.
Yeah.
At the end, it's like they were supposed to stay young looking.
Yeah.
We weren't supposed to have.
Don't have to point out that I'm old looking.
Not the problems we have.
Yeah.
We're supposed to be happy all the time.
Because they rejected the primitive godliness. They let go of what the righteousness that Christ had given them. Days 1 through 6 were all about what God had done for humankind. And on day 7, humankind responded to what God had done. This is our mindset on the Sabbath, to respond to what God is doing and has done in our lives. The Sabbath is both vertical and horizontal. It's perfect for how a man and a woman have been made in the image of God. It's a symbol of marriage with Christ. Now, generally speaking, I don't want to get in trouble here, so hold on. But generally speaking, if you take a group of young ladies and you put them together, and a group of men and you put them together, young men, they're going to spend that time differently, generally speaking. A group of ladies are going to spend time talking about their lives, how they feel about their lives. The men are going to spend time together talking about what they're doing in their lives. For example, I went and got a haircut this week. I had not seen my friend, my barber, Casey, a good man. I had not seen him in several weeks because our workout class had not been working out for a while. I'd been busy, so I wasn't working out. I'd been in Tonopah and things. And so I went in and I talked to Casey a bit and had my haircut. I came home and Sharon asked me, "Hey, how's Casey doing?" I said, "I don't know." She goes, "Didn't he cut your hair?" I said, "Yeah." "What'd you guys talk about?" "Football." That's what we did. That's what a barbershop does. It's what you do. Group of guys together, you talk about what you're doing, your shared experiences. Men bond together, generally speaking, in shared experiences, things they have in common, things they like, hiking, whatever it is. Some guys, it's the, that maybe the typical guy, it's the hunting, the construction, the building, that kind of stuff, right? Stuff that I don't participate in. And then there's the, other guys, it's sports and whatever, and but you bond in shared experiences. Generally speaking, women may look at the exact same thing, but might look at it differently with different goggles. But in the Sabbath, both are called and both are important. Because the Sabbath is a shared experience, it's a time set aside, and it's an emotional connection between God and creation and creation. He created Adam and Eve to complement one another, and then he created the Sabbath to complement both of them. It was not more for Adam, not more for Eve. It was for both man and woman. Sabbath is both a shared experience and an emotional attachment. As a part of the revival of primitive godliness, there will be, guaranteed, there will be also a revival of Sabbath keeping in the world. The Bible is very clear, Ellen White's very clear, that there will be Christians who have never kept the Sabbath who will begin to keep the Sabbath in the last days. Because God is calling his people out of Babylon so they can be one faithful church together. There will also be people within God's church who leave God and leave the Sabbath behind. But many will be called to understand the great but forgotten truth of God's holy Sabbath. Where does judgment begin? Where does the revival of Sabbath keeping begin, church? It always begins with those who know the truth. The revival of the truth of the Bible always begins with those who are proclaiming it. So a revival of Sabbath keeping will come upon the world, but the revival of Sabbath keeping first starts within our local church and church family. The revival must start here with us, both in our shared experience and in our mindset. Sabbath, of course, is not a day to be sitting on the couch sleeping the day away. It's not a day to be taking the day off and relaxing physically by the secular things we could do. It's not a day of shopping and eating out. It's not a day of general secular entertainment. It's not a day to work to make money. It's not a day to be mad and annoyed at our spouses. Because the Sabbath was a day we're to cling to one another, right? I think I've mentioned before that I've noticed in my own home and my own family and in marital counseling, something about Friday afternoons. It's always like the devil's attacking marriages on Friday afternoon and evening. It's not a day he's trying to ruin the day. The Sabbath is not a day to keep those fights going. If you're having a tough time with your home, tough time in your family, tough time in your marriage, make sure you are doing everything possible to pause it on Friday afternoon. Even if you got to pick it back up Saturday night by calling your pastor and saying, Pastor, we need counseling. Do what you can to guard those hours from any kind of temptation and problem. The Sabbath is to be a day of worship, which is both emotional and active participation, a shared experience. And it is a day of service for others, which of course, again, is an emotional and an active participation. We need to go above and beyond. We're not saved by it. We are responding to the gift of the Sabbath. That's true today and in the time of the mark of the beast. We will not be saved by keeping the Sabbath in that time. We will be keeping the Sabbath as a response to the fact that Christ has saved us. So church, I'm looking for a volunteer. I'm looking for someone. I want you to talk to me afterwards. I'm looking for someone in 2019 to be our Sabbath outreach coordinator. Someone who will organize a church-wide outreach to our community 4 times next year. The first Sabbath of every 3rd month of the quarter. March, June, September, and December. I'm looking for someone who wants to coordinate 4 events where we will spend specific, set-aside time together as a church, reaching out after potluck, reaching out to do something for the community. And we could do that every week. We could do that every month. But if we practice it as a group collectively once a quarter, I believe we will start to practice it more as a collective group within our own families. And of course, I should state that keeping of the Sabbath and reaching out to others is all going to be done differently for every family sometimes. When you've got kids, my job on Sabbath afternoon is to do something with my kids. Sometimes we mix in and do things with other families. Sometimes we do things as a church, as a community service. But my job is to do things with my kids because they're my others. That's my community. So those of us who have kids, we have to spend that time thinking and purposefully reasoning, what can we do to keep our kids happy and enjoy? Because remember, we're all called to be feasting and joyful on Sabbath, including those under the age of 18, right? Some of us maybe have grandkids. That's our others. Some of us may not have kids or grandkids, but we can do something for someone in our community, in our neighborhood, our neighbor, something else during these precious hours. We need to get back to primitive godliness, and each week we have a wonderful opportunity to practice that in the love and the rest of Jesus Christ. And don't forget, Esther and Mordecai wrote letters to let others know. It's our responsibility to hold up the recipe of the Sabbath in our personal lives and then to share it with those around us.